There's a word in football that's almost impossible to shake once it's attached to your name: bust. It doesn't matter what you did in college. It doesn't matter how high you were picked. Once enough people say it out loud, it follows you into every headline for the rest of your career. By 1978, that word belonged to Jim Plunkett. He'd been the #1 overall pick in the NFL draft, he'd won the Heisman Trophy, and 7 years later, he was 30 years old, sitting at home, freshly cut by his second NFL team, wondering if his career was already over. He had a losing record with 2 different franchises and nothing to show for either stop. Football writers weren't calling him a prospect anymore. They were calling him a cautionary tale. Think about how rare that fall actually is. Teams don't cut the first overall pick after a few disappointing years and just move on quietly. It becomes a story, a warning label for every general manager who ever considers drafting a quarterback first. Jim Plunkett wore that label for the better part of a decade. 6 years after that release, Jim Plunkett stood on a podium in New Orleans holding a Super Bowl MVP trophy. 3 years after that, he did it again in Tampa, with a second championship ring. No quarterback in NFL history has fallen further from grace and climbed back higher than Jim Plunkett did. This is the story of how the biggest bust of his era became a 2-time Super Bowl champion and somehow still isn't in the Hall of Fame. To understand how far Plunkett had to climb, you have to understand where he started. James William Plunkett was born December 5, 1947, in San Jose, California, to parents who couldn't see him grow up. His mother, Carmen, lost her sight at 20. His father, William, was legally blind from birth but could get around well enough to run a newsstand and support the family. They lived in poverty, relying on state aid to get by. Jim and his 2 older sisters grew up doing things for themselves out of necessity, since their parents simply couldn't do everything a sighted parent could. They even helped Carmen with the cooking and the household chores growing up. As a teenager, Plunkett worked a string of odd jobs to help make ends meet: pumping gas, clerking at a grocery store, laboring in the orchards outside San Jose during the summer. He transferred to James Lick High School in East San Jose before his junior year and became a multi-sport star, good enough to also win a California State Wrestling Championship, on top of standing out in football, basketball, and baseball. When it came time to choose a college, Plunkett had offers on the table, but he picked Stanford largely so he could stay close to his parents. It nearly didn't matter. A month before he was set to enroll, doctors found a lump at the base of his neck. The initial diagnosis was cancer, a malignant tumor that would need surgery and would likely end his football career before it ever started. Stanford assistant coach Rod Rust, who'd recruited him, made the family a promise on the spot. The scholarship would stand no matter what the surgery revealed. The tumor turned out to be benign. Plunkett got a clean bill of health, but the recovery cost him his freshman year, and he came back to spring practice looking so unimpressive that Stanford's coaching staff seriously considered moving him to defensive end. He refused. He wanted to play quarterback, and eventually, the coaches let him try. To get his arm back, Plunkett threw between 500 and 1,000 passes a day, rebuilding the skills the surgery and the layoff had cost him. It worked well enough that by the time he was done at Stanford, a UCLA coach who'd watched him play called him the best pro quarterback prospect he'd ever seen. It wouldn't be the last time in his career that Plunkett had to throw his way back from a setback nobody expected him to survive. Over the years that followed, he'd have 2 separate knee surgeries and break his ribs more than once, on top of everything else. By his own description, he became a day-to-day person, never entirely sure his body would let him keep playing the game he'd nearly lost before it even started. Off the field, people who knew him described someone almost shy, a man of few words, soft-spoken, uneasy with attention. On it, he was aggressive and confident, calling his own plays and reading defenses like a coach in shoulder pads. It was the same contradiction that would define his whole career. A quiet kid from a poor part of San Jose who quietly refused to accept every label anyone tried to stick on him, on the field or off it. It didn't take long to justify the decision. As a sophomore in 1968, Plunkett threw for a Pac-8 conference record 2,156 yards and 14 touchdowns, including a 277-yard, 4-touchdown performance in his very first collegiate start. As a junior in 1969, he broke his own conference records with 2,673 passing yards and 20 touchdowns, good enough for an 8th-place finish in that year's Heisman voting. He had the numbers to leave early for the NFL draft. Instead, he stayed at Stanford. in part because he was tutoring Chicano youth in the area and wanted to set an example about the value of finishing school. That same year, his father died of a heart attack. Plunkett kept playing. His senior season, 1970, is the one people still talk about. He threw for 2,715 yards and 21 touchdowns, led Stanford to a Pac-8 title, and got the program back to the Rose Bowl for the first time in nearly 2 decades, as a heavy underdog against an undefeated, top-ranked Ohio State team many considered nearly unbeatable. Stanford trailed 17-13 late in the third quarter. Then Plunkett and the offense scored 14 unanswered points in the fourth to pull off a 27-17 upset that's still remembered as one of the biggest Rose Bowl shocks of the era, and the game many credit with returning Stanford football to national relevance. That fall, Plunkett was awarded the Heisman Trophy over a field that included future NFL names like Joe Theismann of Notre Dame and Archie Manning of Mississippi, becoming the first player of Hispanic heritage to win college football's biggest individual honor. He left Stanford with an NCAA record for career total offense, 7,887 yards, a mark that stood for 13 years, along with conference records in passing yards, completions, and touchdown passes. Every scouting report said the same thing. This was the best pro prospect in the country. In 1971, the New England Patriots made it official, taking Plunkett with the first overall pick in the NFL Draft, the first and still only player of Hispanic heritage ever drafted number 1. Expectations could not have been higher. For one season, he met them. Plunkett took a Patriots team that had gone 2-12 the year before and helped turn it into a 6-8 club, throwing 19 touchdowns for 2,158 yards and winning AFC Rookie of the Year. His very first NFL start was a win over the team that would one day define his career, the Oakland Raiders. In 1973, he finished second in the entire NFL in passing yards. In 1974, he led New England to a 6-1 start, its best beginning to a season in 8 years, capped by an 88-yard touchdown pass to his old Stanford teammate Randy Vataha that helped knock the division-leading Baltimore Colts down a peg. For a moment, it looked like the sure thing scouts had promised. Then, it started to unravel. The Patriots' offensive line couldn't protect him. The talent around him thinned out. Injuries piled up. Over the next several seasons, his touchdown totals dropped as his interception totals climbed, and New England kept losing more games than it won with him under center. By 1975, a shoulder injury opened the door for a rookie named Steve Grogan, and the franchise leaned into a run-first offense that had no more use for the guy who was supposed to be its franchise savior. In 5 years as a Patriot, Plunkett went 23-38, completed less than half his passes, and threw 87 interceptions against just 62 touchdowns. New England had seen enough. Before the 1976 draft, they traded him to the San Francisco 49ers, and used the extra picks they got in return to draft a cornerback named Mike Haynes, who'd go on to torment his old team as a Hall of Famer. San Francisco was supposed to be the reset. Plunkett was coming home to the Bay Area, close to family and friends, and he said so himself. "I really thought I was going to be the savior, but all I did was put more pressure on myself." That internal pressure showed up in the results. The 49ers started 6-1 with him at the helm in 1976, then collapsed to finish 8-6, with Plunkett completing just 51.9% of his passes for 1,592 yards, throwing 16 interceptions against only 13 touchdowns. In 1977, the whole team fell apart, dropping to 5-9 and third in their division. Plunkett had done nothing to change the narrative that had followed him out of New England. Ahead of the 1978 season, with a year still left on his contract, the 49ers cut him loose anyway. It was the first time in his life, in any sport, that Plunkett had ever been cut from a team. "It was quite depressing," he admitted later. "I didn't know if I wanted to continue playing football or change my lifestyle and do something else." He was 30 years old, sitting on a career record of 34 wins and 53 losses across 7 seasons, with 2 franchises, without a single playoff appearance to his name. The number 1 overall pick, the Heisman winner, the best pro prospect anyone had ever seen. By every measure that mattered on paper, Jim Plunkett was officially a bust. A few weeks after his release, Raiders owner Al Davis called. He wasn't offering a starting job. He was offering a clipboard, a backup role behind veteran Ken Stabler, and a 3-year, $465,000 contract that felt, to a lot of people watching, like the last stop before retirement. Plunkett took it anyway, choosing to stay in the Bay Area rather than chase a starting job somewhere else. In 1978, he didn't throw a single regular season pass. In 1979, he threw exactly 15, including 1 touchdown and 1 interception. For 2 straight years, Jim Plunkett was the most accomplished clipboard holder in professional football. A former #1 pick and Heisman winner who spent his Sundays holding a play sheet and watching someone else run the offense he was drafted to run for a different team 7 years earlier. Then, in the span of about 6 weeks in 1980, everything changed. Before that season began, the Raiders traded Ken Stabler to the Houston Oilers for quarterback Dan Pastorini, all but guaranteeing Plunkett would keep riding the bench. Plunkett was so certain of it that he actually asked the Raiders to trade him somewhere he might play. They said no. In Week 5, against the Kansas City Chiefs, Pastorini broke his leg. Plunkett, 32 years old and 4 years removed from anyone calling him a franchise quarterback, got the start. His first game back went 11 of 14 passing for a touchdown and no interceptions. He never gave the job back. Plunkett led the Raiders to 9 wins in their final 11 games, dragging a team that had started slow into a wild-card playoff spot. It wasn't a clean, mistake-free run either. That 1980 Raiders team turned the ball over 44 times all season, and Plunkett himself completed just 51% of his passes with 16 interceptions against 18 touchdowns. This wasn't a stats darling putting up a highlight reel. This was a team finding a way to win with a quarterback nobody trusted a year earlier. Then the postseason started, and the comeback kept building. Oakland beat the Houston Oilers, then the Cleveland Browns, then the San Diego Chargers, winning 4 straight playoff games behind him, culminating in Super Bowl 15 against the Philadelphia Eagles on January 25, 1981, in New Orleans. The Raiders won 27-10, becoming the first wildcard team in NFL history to capture a championship. Plunkett threw for 261 yards and 3 touchdowns, posting a 145 passer rating, and was named Super Bowl MVP, becoming just the second player in NFL history, after Roger Staubach, to add a Super Bowl MVP trophy to a Heisman Trophy. The NFL handed him its Comeback Player of the Year award for a season that had started with him as an afterthought and ended with him holding the Lombardi Trophy. The word bust doesn't survive a season like that, but Plunkett's story wasn't done proving its own point yet, because 1981 immediately buried him in injuries, and by 1983, after the franchise had relocated to Los Angeles, he'd lost his job all over again. He opened that season as the starter, but after throwing 3 interceptions in a Week 7 loss to the Seattle Seahawks, the Raiders benched him in favor of second-year quarterback Mark Wilson. 3 years removed from a championship, Plunkett was back to holding a clipboard. 3 weeks later, Wilson broke his shoulder, and Plunkett was back under center for good. Head coach Tom Flores noticed the difference immediately. "It was amazing what 3 weeks off did for him," Flores said. "He was like a new guy. He was fresh, crisp, he moved better in the pocket." Plunkett started the final 13 games of the regular season, going 10-3, throwing for 2,935 yards with 20 touchdowns against 18 interceptions, arguably his best statistical season as a pro, and carrying the Raiders to a 12-4 record and the AFC West title. In the playoffs, Plunkett beat the Pittsburgh Steelers 38-10 and the Seattle Seahawks 30-14, setting up a Super Bowl date with the defending champion Washington Redskins on January 22, 1984, in Tampa. The Raiders demolished Washington 38-9. Running back Marcus Allen stole the headlines that day with a Super Bowl record 191 rushing yards, becoming the 3rd player in NFL history to add a Super Bowl MVP to a Heisman Trophy, following Roger Staubach and, 3 years earlier, Plunkett himself. But Plunkett did his part quietly and efficiently that day, completing 16 of 25 passes for 172 yards, including a 50-yard connection with Cliff Branch that set up a 12-yard touchdown pass to Branch 2 plays later. No turnovers, no wasted possessions. Just a quarterback who'd been benched 3 months earlier doing exactly enough to win his second championship. Plunkett had done what almost no quarterback in NFL history manages even once. He'd been benched, written off, and forced to reclaim a starting job. Twice, and both times he'd walked away with a championship ring to show for it. He played 3 more seasons after that, retiring following the 1986 campaign. His final NFL numbers: 157 games played, 3,701 pass attempts, 1,943 completions, 25,882 passing yards, 164 touchdown passes, and 2 Super Bowl rings that a lot of people once assumed he'd never sniff. With the Raiders specifically, across 9 seasons, he threw for 12,665 yards and 80 touchdowns, still the 4th leading passer in franchise history. He was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 1990 for what he'd done at Stanford. The Pro Football Hall of Fame, the one in Canton that's supposed to house the best to ever play the pro game, is a different story. Jim Plunkett has never been inducted. As of today, he remains one of only 2 eligible starting quarterbacks in NFL history, with multiple Super Bowl championships, who isn't enshrined in Canton, the other being Eli Manning. Plunkett has been nominated in the Hall's senior category in recent years, most recently among the 162 senior nominees announced for the class of 2026, but he has not yet advanced to finalist status the way former Raiders teammate Lester Hayes has. Part of the case against him is the same thing that always followed him. For large stretches of his career, he wasn't the guy who was supposed to be great, he was the guy who stepped in when someone else got hurt, and outside of his 2 Super Bowl runs, a lot of his career numbers read as ordinary at best. Critics point to a modest career completion percentage, just 52.5% for his career, and a stat line built more on grit than gaudiness, with almost as many interceptions, 198, as touchdowns, 164. Supporters counter that no quarterback in league history has authored a bigger turnaround story twice on the same team, and that both times it ended in a championship parade instead of a highlight reel stat line nobody remembers. Canton hasn't called yet, but recognition has started arriving from other places. In May 2026, Plunkett was inducted into the inaugural class of the Hispanic Football Hall of Fame, alongside fellow Raiders legends and Pro Football Hall of Famers Tom Flores and Ted Hendricks. A fitting honor for a player who remains the first, and still only, quarterback of Hispanic heritage ever selected first overall in the NFL Draft, and the first Latino player ever named Super Bowl MVP. For a kid who grew up translating the world for 2 parents who couldn't see it, being remembered as a trailblazer carries its own kind of weight, separate from whatever Canton eventually decides. After retiring, Plunkett stayed close to the Bay Area that raised him, settling in Atherton, California, not far from the San Jose neighborhood where he grew up watching his parents navigate a world they couldn't see. He spent time as a radio commentator beginning in 1990, co-hosting a Raiders talk show on KFI AM, but largely kept a low profile in the decades since, letting the 2 rings speak for a career that had been left for dead more than once. In recent years, health issues have limited how often he appears in public, but the recognition has kept finding him anyway. Nominations, honors, and a fan base in the Bay Area that never stopped arguing his case. Go back and look at the resume now, and the label from 1978 looks almost absurd. A bust doesn't come off a 2-year stretch without throwing a meaningful pass and lead a team to a title in 11 weeks. A bust doesn't get benched mid-season and come back 3 months later to win a second championship. Jim Plunkett wasn't a finished product the way scouts promised when the Patriots made him the first pick of the 1971 draft. He was something harder to project and harder to find. A quarterback who simply refused to stay written off. Every team that gave up on him watched him find his way back onto a football field somewhere else. The one team that kept giving him a second chance, and a third, ended up world champions twice. Consider what it actually took to get there. A tumor scare before he ever played a college down. A father who died while he was still trying to prove himself at Stanford. 7 losing seasons and a release that felt like the end. 2 more benchings, years apart, on the same team that had already given him 1 championship. Most careers don't survive one of those setbacks. Plunkett survived all of them, back to back to back, and somehow ended with 2 rings instead of 0. That's not a bust. That's the best example the NFL has of a player everyone stopped believing in, right before he proved every single one of them wrong. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. There are a lot more forgotten legends where this one came from.